Good afternoon, my name is Tony Wright and today I'm going to be giving a presentation on an introduction to social work. So the topics that I'm going to discuss are the historical development of social work and how those changes relate to contemporary practice, the impact of the law on the role of a social worker, the role of a social worker in current practice, the key requirements of a professional body related to the role of a social worker, comparison of the organisation of social work and social care services in statutory, voluntary and independent sectors, and finally an analysis of the main purpose and values of social work. The concept and profession of a social worker has evolved and developed greatly throughout history. There was a time in the early 19th century where the role in which we know now was divided into various different positions. For example, there were poor law relieving officers, school attendance officers, and friendly visitors of charity organisation society. Here I will highlight just a few groundbreaking changes and developments which made social work as it is today. So in 1864, Octavia Hill, who was a teacher and artist, began working in poorer neighbourhoods in London. With a financial investment from art critic John Ruskin, Octavia bought 3 houses and rented them to people in need, which saw the beginning and the development of social housing. She believed in the self-reliance and empowerment of tenants, ensuring that her and her assistants personally knew each tenant. Octavia aimed to educate and change the habits of the poor instead of them just falling into the reliance of charity and never seeing an improvement or change in their lives. In 1869, Octavia Hill and Helen Bosanquet founded the Charity Organisation Society. This organisation pioneered the concept of casework and home visiting services, which are paramount to modern-day social workers, where research was made into the individuals involved, aiming to help the poor improve their circumstances rather than just distribute impersonal financial handouts without any further support, education or understanding. During a charity organisation review in 1886, the term social work was first used and has since been a widely understood term for what used to be known as a variety of different roles. In 1884, the London Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded by Benjamin Moore, who was a child protection campaigner. Its purpose was to protect children from harm, abuse and cruelty. After campaigning for 5 years, the UK passed its first law by Parliament to protect children from abuse and harm, meaning that for the first time in the UK, harming or abusing a child could now be punishable by law. In this same year, 1889, the London SPCC was renamed the NSPCC, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which could then include branches across Britain and Ireland. Then in 1904, Joseph Rowntree founded the Rowntree Foundation, with the understanding and belief that ongoing social research was needed to understand and prevent the causes of social problems, as opposed to just treating the outcomes. The Rowntree Foundation is still promoting change through research today. In 1935, the British Federation for Social Workers was formed. Its members included main associations for nursing, children, public health, mental health and probation. The unity of these organisations within the Federation meant cohesion, efficiency and communication between associations. Then during the Second World War, the Labour government introduced the welfare state, where the government took responsibility for the welfare and economic well-being of its citizens. Families were given support because of their rights, as opposed to just for religious reasons, which was previously the case. The British Association for Social Work was formed in 1970 by the unity of many different associations, including the Association of Family Caseworkers, Association for Childcare Officers, and the British Federation for Social Workers, which I've just discussed. This association has a clear and firm code of ethics and supports social workers to give their best practice. Joan Barraclough, who was Assistant Secretary in the early years, said that people needing help would pass from pillar to post, which is why it was believed they should all unite and create one door, social workers. So as can be seen throughout the timeline of social work, there were many key elements in history which led to social work being as it is today. A casework approach to supporting the vulnerable and those in need. As society is constantly and rapidly evolving, the social services is a vital part of many people's lives. It is a part of a multi-dynamic support network, providing a person-centred approach to support. So, the impact of the law on a social worker. To officially be classed as and to be able to work as a social worker in the UK, a person must have obtained a social worker degree or master's degree by an accredited university. They must also be registered to their local care council and adhere to the code of practice. The law provides the foundations and framework for complex cases and scenarios that social workers will face, and legal consequences can take place in times of negligence. However, the law does also protect social workers when intervention is necessary, for example, during the safeguarding of children or vulnerable people. Within social work, though, cases will be complex, and some of the laws and codes of practice are constructed in such a way to allow the social worker the ability to not necessarily just follow one path or outcome. For example, the Code of Ethics constructed by the British Association of Social Work explains that information can only be divulged on a client with their consent unless there is evidence of serious concerns or the judgment of the professional believes that it is in their best interest. This protects social workers from legal action to be taken against them in cases like the intervention of a safeguarding concern. There are several laws and acts that have been passed which shape the way in which social workers operate. Now I'm just going to explain a few of them here. So the Children and Family Act 2014. This act, passed in 2014, covers a wide range of laws and policies, including identifying and supporting children with special needs, education and healthcare plans, and children in care, primarily bringing in changes to the adoption processes. These changes were aimed to reduce the time children spent in care, prospectively making the adoption process quicker and easier. Where possible, it is encouraged for children to be placed with a family member or friend straight away, but if not possible, to get them into a foster to adopt setting. It has also taken away the requirement for race, religion, and culture to be a consideration for a prospective adopter. These changes have caused controversy since being brought into place. Here are just a few of the positive changes, as well as parts which have been argued to be negative or just have not worked. So promoting foster to adopt causes much less upheaval for the child, having to move home after relationships have been built with a foster family and then having to start all over again with an adoptive family. It aims to support children with ethnic minorities to be adopted quicker by not having to find families with matching or similar ethnic backgrounds. Adoptive parents also now have the same rights to parental leave as biological parents, allowing them the time to settle in and build bonds without the financial worries of them not working. However, these points have been argued. There was a doubt that Black and Asian children would be adopted quicker, even without needing to find an ethnic match. If the changes in the Act were proven to have worked, the statistics would show the adoption rates increasing with times taken decreasing. In 2020 to 2021, there were fewest adoptions since 1999 to 2000. Although the pandemic would have affected this year in particular, there has been a continual decrease in the number of successful adoptions taking place each year since its short peak in 2014 to 2015, just after this Act was passed. This highlights that much more is needed to successfully, smoothly, and quickly get vulnerable, looked after children adopted. Then the Human Rights Act 1998. The Human Rights Act 1998 stands for every person living in the UK. It is aimed to bring equality for all. Social workers must have a thorough knowledge of everyone's human rights and will support people to empower themselves and to obtain their own human rights. However, there will be occasions where the professional opinion can and will override certain elements for the greater good. For instance, respect for privacy and family life. In the circumstance of a safeguarding concern, this is imperative that a social worker discloses information of concern with managers and a network of other professionals to seek the best outcome for the individuals at risk. When there is a serious concern for a child's safety against harm or abuse, between a social worker and the courts, children can and will be taken away from their family life. This decision must be made with evidence, information, and purely for the protection of the child or person at risk. So, roles in a current setting. The role of a social worker covers a diverse span. They can work with young babies throughout to the elderly, and the role is to protect from harm and improve the outcome of people's lives. There are social worker roles working with children in care, supporting fostering and adoption processes, working with people with disabilities or learning difficulties, drug or alcohol abusers, asylum seekers and refugees, criminal convicts, and the homeless, just to name a few. Social workers must always remain professional with relationships and be an advocate and a voice for the vulnerable. They will work as part of a multidisciplinary team, for example, working with the police, lawyers, doctors, and teachers to create the best possible outcome and the biggest improvement to people's lives. Often social workers will specialise in a specific role. For example, in mental health care, social workers can be trained to become approved mental health care professionals. They are often the link between different organisations. They offer support and can assist or be an advocate for people through legal issues. There are also statutory and non-statutory roles. Statutory roles are funded by the government, so they must abide and uphold the law and legislations in roles such as safeguarding of children and positions in councils or the NHS. Non-statutory roles are often in charities or private positions, for example, working with the charities to support addicts or people with learning difficulties. I'll discuss the difference between these shortly. So the work of a social worker is often under scrutiny, especially in cases where a child is taken away from its home. And in the cases where things go wrong, it is often shared intensely by the media in a very negative light. So the key requirements of a professional body for social workers. Social Work England is the current regulative body for social workers in England. It sets out specific requirements for what people must know, the skills they must have, and their ability to carry out their work before being able to register. Social workers must also re-register every 2 years to keep up to date with changes and training as the requirements of a social worker continues to change and develop. Social Work England issues expected standards, code of conduct and ethics, and sets rules and limits for social workers to work within. If these standards aren't maintained, a tribunal can take place to confirm if disciplinary action needs to be taken. This could result in a social worker being struck off and not able to re-register, therefore no longer practice as a social worker. As discussed, the role of a social worker is extremely broad, and there are various specialisations of a social worker can take. As well as this, I briefly touched on that there are also various organisations, for example, statutory, voluntary, and independent. Statutory roles include those in social services, local adult and children's teams, and NHS trusts, and they hold legal duties and responsibilities. Social workers in statutory settings are often required to assess the need for care, then develop plans and implement safeguarding policies. They can be the link to organise referrals to specialists where required and also work along many other organisations. Voluntary roles are often within charity organisations. These often begin with a purpose where a gap or a misjustice has been identified and has then been campaigned for. Unlike statutory settings, this often makes the voluntary roles much more specific to their support and services. Although the purpose of the roles and the tasks are the same, with voluntary roles not holding the same legal responsibility as statutory, there is much more flexibility for innovation and intervention, which can tailor the support more personally to people's exact needs. Finally, the independent sector, which is the private sector, which also covers all nursing homes and residential housing, and also the voluntary division. Like all other social workers, they're still governed by a regulatory body and must uphold the same professional values. They can often offer flexibility for organisations such as government agencies to outsource the expertise and support at a much lower cost than having to employ somebody in a permanent full-time role. Social workers, for example, in the independent sector working with fostering and adoption, have the exact same roles and responsibilities as those in a statutory setting. So, an analysis on the main purpose and values of a social worker. As discussed, The role of a social worker is extremely broad and diverse, but the primary purpose of a social worker is to resolve challenges faced by the vulnerable. They promote the empowerment and support people to gain the education and resources needed to be able to make positive changes in their lives and obtain their own human rights. Social workers working with families assist to enhance parenting skills to promote the healthy development for children, although when necessary, they arrange the best care and support when the home isn't able to provide what is needed for the child or the vulnerable people to thrive. The work of a social worker in other divisions, such as working with people with addictions, will have very different daily duties. However, the main purposes and values are still the same. They still provide the vulnerable with support in a non-discriminatory or judgmental manner and work with various other specialists to promote positive change with education, opportunity and assistance. The National Association for Social Work, which is the American equal to the British Association for Social Work, sets out their core values perfectly in their code of ethics. These 6 are: service. The primary goal of a social worker is to help people. Social justice. They work to eliminate injustices in society and promote equality and diversity. Dignity and worth of the person. They treat everyone with respect and promote people's independence and support individuals to make positive changes in their lives. Importance of human relationships. Social workers recognise the benefits of integrating with society and building relationships with families, friends, and the community. Integrity. They build relationships based on trust and care. And finally, competence. Social workers must continue to develop their knowledge and skills to be fully competent in their position. So to summarise, the role of a social worker isn't exact or set. It has evolved greatly throughout history and will continue to evolve as the needs of society changes and develop. A social worker is a key person in the life of vulnerable, and they're often a voice, an advocate, and a role model. Here I have included a list of all my references used and a bibliography of all the reading materials that I used to put this presentation together. Thank you very much.